Most of the time, we think of natural disasters as things we just can't do anything about. Their destructive effects seem essentially random. That's why we call them acts of God. But while it's true that human beings don't generally cause natural disasters, their actions often make the effects worse and ensure that the effects are not felt randomly. A great example of this can be seen in the town of Hannibal, Missouri. Hannibal's a charming little town whose main industry is tourism. Billing itself as America's hometown, Hannibal's the birthplace of famed author Mark Twain. His birthplace is located downtown, right next to the white picket fence that Tom Sawyer persuaded friends to paint on his behalf. But Hannibal has a problem. It's located on the banks of the Mississippi River. Like most cities on the Mississippi, it's subject to frequent and intense flooding. In the summer of 1993, the Mississippi River experienced one of the largest floods in its history, flooding more than 30,000 square miles and causing more than $15 billion in damage. But downtown Hannibal escaped completely unscathed. For 8 years, the Army Corps of Engineers had been building a flood wall that was 3,000 feet long and 12 feet high that surrounded the city like a fort. Construction was completed a mere 1 month before the 1993 flood, making Hannibal seem like the luckiest city in America. But not everyone was so lucky. Downtown Hannibal is a wealthy area with lots of shops, restaurants, and well-kept houses. South of downtown is an area known as Bear Creek Bottom, a less affluent neighborhood filled with poor and minority residents. The idea of a flood wall was first proposed in 1962. At the time, the idea was to build a much longer flood wall that would include both downtown and Bear Creek Bottom. However, wealthy business interests opposed the flood wall because it would require a tax increase, and the proposal was killed. In 1973, plans for a flood wall were resurrected after yet another major flood, and construction began in 1985. Now, however, the flood wall was substantially shorter than originally planned and protected only the downtown area. The results were entirely predictable. While downtown Hannibal was spared from the destruction of the Great Flood of 1993, Bear Creek Bottom was devastated, remaining underwater for 174 days. Local residents recognized the inherent inequality of the situation. Resident Sheila Todd said, "We can't afford to live anywhere but down here where it floods. It's always the poorest people who get screwed." Resident Virginia Foyle said, "They put in a flood wall to save Mark Twain's house and all that stuff about that dead man, so I don't know why they don't help the living." And Donna Paget said, "Hannibal's for Mark Twain and Mark Twain only. They could care less about their people." But the residents of Bear Creek Bottom had it even worse than they knew. Flood walls protect neighborhoods by channeling the destructive force of the water into a confined space. But this means that the communities downstream from a flood wall, such as Bear Creek Bottom, experience greater destruction than they would if the water had been allowed to dissipate naturally. The local newspaper, the Hannibal Courier-Post, whose offices were located downtown and were undamaged during the flooding, had little sympathy for the victims. "We realize that the flood wall does not protect everyone, and that it is indeed regrettable. But wherever a line is drawn, someone will always be just on the wrong side of it." This is only one example of a natural disaster that disproportionately affected poor and minority residents in the United States. Other examples abound. In 1928, a hurricane killed at least 1,836 mostly black migrant workers in the Florida Everglades for planting season. That number is almost certainly low because government leaders admitted to the New York Times that, quote, "the names of Negroes were not always included." In a particularly tragic incident in 1935, at least 408 people died in a hurricane that hit the Florida Keys. 256 of those 408 fatalities were poor veterans of World War I. They'd been sent to the Florida Keys by the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to help build a highway connecting the islands in South Florida. These veterans died simply because the government didn't have a plan to evacuate them in the event of an emergency. And did you ever notice that mobile homes seem to be destroyed a lot in natural disasters. It's not just your imagination. Between 1981 and 1997, tornadoes in the United States killed more than 850 people. Fully one-third of them were residents of mobile homes. 150 people. Fully one-third of them were residents of mobile homes, which disproportionately house poor, elderly, and disabled residents. And of course, the most famous example was Hurricane Katrina, which destroyed large sections of New Orleans in August 2005. Approximately 80% of the city was inundated, with the damage concentrated among the city's poorest neighborhoods. The state and federal responses, both during and after the storm, were so inadequate that during a live TV special designed to raise money for Katrina's victims, a young Kanye West declared,
"George Bush doesn't care about black people."
Communities hit by the natural disaster continue to feel the pain the destruction left and remember those they lost.
We wanted to honor the lives of the folks who passed during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and also just celebrate the New Orleanians who were rebuilding.
Sess is one of the many who marks the disaster every year since 2006. He also raises awareness for the racial inequalities and inadequacies in the government's response after Katrina.
Well, we want to make sure that no one ever forgets, what happened to, black citizens. They left folks on the roofs and, on the bridges in the Superdome and Convention Center for over 5 days with no assistance.
While it's clear that natural disasters disproportionately affect poor and minority residents, the question is, why? We'll explore that in the next video.